All right, the title of our successful proposal is shown up here at the top of the slide: Abandonment and Rebound, Societal Views of Landscape and Land Use Change and Their Impacts on Water and Soils. And the overarching goal of the ABRESO project is to develop a global transdisciplinary platform for understanding the impacts of land abandonment on sustainability of soil and water resources within the framework of the critical zone concept. And just hang on patiently, I will explain the critical zone for those who aren't familiar with that name. The project melds the natural and social sciences to address the evolution of soil and water resources in response to changing climate, demographics, and human needs and perceptions, and will use advanced techniques to understand the ways in which biophysical and societal landscapes are linked to water resources and environmental decision-making. The project study sites have stakeholders predisposed to alter the land as well as to preserve it. Culturally, the range of countries vary in their individualist versus collectivist social tendencies and in their focus on short versus long-term planning horizons. And we propose that coordinating the social science findings across these nations will allow us to contribute to understanding cultural differences in environmental decision-making. Now, there's a lot more we could say about the project, but you're going to hear a lot in the following presentations and in our breakout group. So I'm going to move on to the critical zone. It's a term that was published around the year 2000, formally by the U.S. National Research Council. The definition is it's the thin veneer at Earth's surface spanning from the top of vegetation through soil to the bottom of the fresh groundwater zone. It's where rock meets life, and it's where most terrestrial life exists and depends on. And critical zone science is a transdisciplinary approach to Earth's surface and environmental science. The upper boundary of the critical zone extends to the top of the vegetation canopy. It's relatively easy to see, but it's heterogeneous and complex and requires high frequency information to understand. The lower boundary equates to the bottom of the groundwater zone, and it's diffuse and variable and can be as deep as 1 kilometer or more. It's more difficult to define than the upper boundary, and the relative paucity of life and lack of the atmosphere somewhat simplifies its study and requires lower frequency data to understand. I like to think of the critical zone in terms of extremes, and here you can see a tropical rainforest with an extensive forest canopy with complex understory, maybe measured in tens of meters, many tens of meters, with thick, mature soils, deeply weathered regolith, and potentially deep aquifers. Whereas if we jump to the polar realm, the high latitudes, it's a stunted vegetation with glaciers, bare bedrock, thin discontinuous soils, and permafrost. So in a place like this, the critical zone might be measured in tens of centimeters or maybe meters seasonally. This is a plot from a 2017 paper in Geophysical Research Letters showing the thickness of the critical zone with latitude. And there's 2 points I want to make here. First is that about 80% of the critical zone globally exists below our feet in that zone that we can't easily see. And the other point I want to make is that if you look at this plot, contrary to what I just said, showing you the extremes from the tropics to the poles, the place where the critical zone is thickest is in the middle latitudes. So this points to another point I want to make about this is depth. There's not only the depth below the subsurface, below our feet, but there's also the depth in time. And so critical zone science includes consideration of the legacy of past climates. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over this talking about warm periods and cold periods, but just please leave this with the understanding that critical zone science brings together a bunch of things, but includes depth, the realm of geologists, and depth in time. Okay, there's a lot more I could say, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to Osamu, who's going to speak to you about some of the social science aspects of the ABRESO project.
Thank you, Tim. My name is Osamu Saito. I'm a principal policy researcher at the Institute of the Global Environmental Strategy located in Japan. I've been involved in the intergovernmental platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services, which is called IPBES. IPBES was established in 2012 to provide IPCC-like global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And they use a concept, at the beginning, they use a concept of the ecosystem services. And the ecosystem service was defined by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was conducted year of 2000 to 2005. And it was, ecosystem services were categorized into four subtype of the ecosystem services, which is supporting, regulating, cultural, and provisioning services. So you can find the initial definition of ecosystem services in the left-hand side. In general, ecosystem services are understood as a benefit provided from the nature. Then when the IPBES started, they also reconceptualize these ecosystem services to broaden the concept to capture the utilitarian values. So they try to extend the concept of the ecosystem services to capture the wide view of the ecosystem services or natures, the benefit from nature. So they use the term, the nature's gift, and in the middle, you can see that in regulating ecosystem services, cultural ecosystem services, and the provisioning ecosystem services. Then in 2017, when they publish regional ecosystem service assessment report and also the global ecosystem assessment report, they also slightly modify this term of the ecosystem services. They now use the term, the nature's contribution to people. The reason behind is also that try to extend this concept to capture the wide world view, and also the capture not only the benefit, but also the disservices for people. So nature has sometimes like a human-wildlife conflict or damage by the wild animal on the agriculture products. So in order to capture such kind of negative contribution of the nature, they use the term the nature's contribution to people. And now the nature's contribution to people, NCP, are subdivided into regulating NCP, non-material NCP, and material NCP. So throughout our this ABRESO project, we also need to kind of consider this kind of global the change of the global terminology of the global assessment. So we will follow this kind of concept which was discussed or determined by the IPBES. Please go to the next slide. And I will also, could you go to the next slide?
I'm trying for some reason. There you
go. Thank you. Okay, thank you. And then this NCP concept is subdivided into the 18 the category. So I will not go into detail about this, but these are now the 18 subcategories are identified under the material NCP, non-material NCP, and regulating NCP. So when we conduct the research, we will also use this subcategory of the ecosystem services or NCP. Thank you. Please go next slide. And then also the IPBES recognize the wide range of the values provided from nature. So in addition to using the concept of the NCP, NCP include the instrumental values and also the relational values and also the intrinsic values. So nature itself has the intrinsic value, And NCP can be also the categorize instrumental and relational values. So these wide variety of values also need to be considered. So these also will be considered for our study too. And please go to the next slide too. Thank you. And then using these intrinsic values and then also the instrumental values and relational values, they also, IPBES is also proposing a new conceptual framework to build future scenarios, which is called the Nature Futures Framework. This triangle, you can see the top of the triangle, nature for nature, which recognize, emphasize the importance of the intrinsic value of nature. And then left-hand side, the nature as culture, also implies or emphasize the importance of the relational values of nature, or living in harmony with people, with nature. And the nature for society emphasize instrumental value, which is maximizing the benefit to people from nature. Next slide, please. This triangle also try to further elaborate this nature future framework and also recognize there is the point in between the nature for nature, in between nature for nature and nature as culture, and also that there is a point between the nature as culture and the nature of society. So these 6 points are kind of representing the different variety for the future path or direction of the nature future framework or future scenarios. Thank you very much. I will pass on to Adam.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Osamu, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. I'm Adam Wymore. I'm at the University of New Hampshire in the Department of Natural Resources and the Environment. I'm a watershed biogeochemist and interested in the controls on solute export to stream and rivers, and then the implications of that for surface water chemistry and water quality. And I'm going to talk very briefly here about one of our overarching methods that we're going to be applying to our array of research sites. And as you likely inferred from Tim's brief overview of the critical zone, one of the overarching goals of critical zone science is to develop a mechanistic and predictive understanding of the critical zone structure, function, and long-term evolution. One method that critical zone science is employed to understand those relationships is what's called concentration discharge relationships, or CQ relationships. I'm going to talk just briefly about that method and give some examples of how we've applied it in the past. The power of CQ relationships is that it's an integrative three-dimensional assessment of the critical zone. Next slide, please. And as you can see from the schematic of the critical zone, because of gravity and hydrological connectivity, the river provides an integrative signal of all the processes and mechanisms in the structure of the critical zone, of what's happening at depth, as Tim talked about, what's happening in the weathering zone, what's happening in the soils, what's happening in the ecosystem. And all of that, all of those processes manifest themselves into stream chemistry. And by examining how solute chemistry changes with changes in river flows, we can make inferences about the critical zone structure, function, and long-term evolution. Next slide, please. We generally recognize three relationships, three CQ type of relationships. And these three figures demonstrate these relationships with solute concentration on the y-axis and changes in discharge on the x-axis. The top slide showing us an enrichment relationship, which means that the transport of those solutes are primarily transport limited. I'm going to jump to the bottom slide, which we have a negative relationship or dilution, which indicates that the solute is primarily source limited. And then we have the middle panel, which we call chemostasis. So that's when the concentrations of solutes appear independent of changes in discharge. Next slide, please. And here are some examples of where we've used this before. These data come from a tropical environment, the Luquillo Critical Zone Observatory in Puerto Rico. And the panels on the left-hand side show you those three relationships of what an enrichment relationship looks like, chemostasis, and a dilution or source transport, source limited relationship. And but to make inferences, what the next figure shows us is how those relationships, those CQ relationships change with changes in lithology, for example, the bottom of the critical zone, topography, the shape of the critical zone, and with differences in vegetation. So if you look at the top panel, for example, the 4 points that I've circled there in the bottom left-hand corner are from a volcanoclastic type of landscape. And that's showing us that the phosphate in this example is primarily derived from weathering. But the single point up there labeled granitic has a completely different CQ relationship. And that tells us something different about the controls on phosphate in this example. And this is how we can start to understand the critical zone and start pulling apart different processes that are happening in the landscape. Next slide, please. But of course, it's not as simple as 1, 2, 3 relationships. And this figure shows us the complexity of concentration discharge relationships. And what I just want you to take away from these figures is the fact that there are these really interesting inflection points. And we can actually take away 9 different relationships based on these inflection points. And all of these tell us different things about the critical zone. So when we start to apply this over space and over time, we can understand how the critical zone is changing. Next slide, please. These data show us interannual and seasonal variability in CQ relationships too. So it's not just that a watershed or a critical zone has a particular type of CQ relationship, but that it's really highly variable and it's heterogeneous, and that we have to think about this type of variability on multiple different timescales. These data are collected from one of our ABRESO research sites here in New Hampshire. And you can see very basically that we can have a single site that demonstrates all 3 different patterns. And I'll talk briefly in a second about why this is important. But you can see each of those sites is labeled by the dominant kind of land cover or topographic feature. And that as we get into agriculture and there are organic dairy sites, we get these really distinct relationships. Next slide, please. What this figure is showing us a bit more detail is how these CQ relationships change with development or agriculture. The top figure is nitrate, for a common source of nitrogen, often applied in agricultural situations or coming from septic tanks. And the bottom figure is for dissolved organic matter. And you can see, especially for nitrogen, that there are clear patterns of how that CQ relationship changes with more development in agriculture. Next slide, please. So I realize I've kept this very brief due to time, but what I want to emphasize here is that we can use CQ relationships to, one, understand the relationship between critical zone structure and function. And we can also understand them to make inferences regarding how changes in land use or land cover or climate change are influencing the way the landscape is functioning. And we can apply those inferences to understanding controls on surface water chemistry and water quality. These CQ relationships are very important to develop accurate models of solute flux for watershed managers. And then we can also use these CQ relationships, lastly, to understand how landscape is responding to land abandonment, its inherent resilience, and projections into the future. Thank you very much.
All right, while I flounder around and get to a new slide set, if anyone has any questions, now's a good time to ask. Any questions or comments? Nothing. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Can anyone
No
hear me?
question.
Yes.
Yes, no question.
No questions. And we're going to move straight into our presentations from our partner nations. Again, I'm going to ask the presenters to briefly self-introduce yourselves, and we'll begin with our French colleague. I think Philippe is going to start off. Philippe, you're up.
Yes. Thank you, Tim. So my name is Philippe Coent. I'm an environmental economist working at the French Geological Survey. See here the team of researchers that are going to be involved in this project, which is a mixture of economists and also hydrogeologists. So the project in France, next slide, please. The project in France is going to be implemented in the south of France. And is going to have two sites. There are a few animation on this one, so you can go up to the end of the slide. So in the south of France, yeah, thanks. In the south of France, and there is going to be implemented in two different sites, the Les aquifer and the Vistranck aquifer. In both cases, it's characterized by Mediterranean climates with different type of critical zone context. The Les is a karstic system. In the Vistranck is a context of alluvial deposits. In both cases, we are going to be concerned about the links between land use change and especially abandonment with what happens at the surface with the ecosystem and also in groundwater. Next slide, please. So in the Les context, in terms of land use change, there has been some vineyard abandonment in the past, and more recently a rebound of the development of vineyard. And also there has been quite a development of urbanization due to the attractiveness of the territory, and that has also provoked some land abandonment around cities. And there has been in the past a decay of pastures. And in terms of critical zone challenges, one of the main challenges is the fact that this area ensures drinking water for the city of Montpellier, which represents 340,000 inhabitants in 2020. And what we are concerned about is looking at the impact of these land use changes and also farming practices on the aquifer recharge in the Les aquifer, in the Les watershed. In the second case, we have a similar type of land use dynamics. We've had more important vineyard abandonment in this area, also a context of urbanization related to some land abandonment as well. And there has been some development of large infrastructure. This development of large infrastructure have been linked to the development of large biodiversity offsets program that have probably, and this needs to be determined, led to the increase of pastures. And there is also quite significant vegetable production in the area. The critical zone challenge is a bit different here in the area. We also relate to the need to provide drinking water for 150,000 inhabitants. But in this area, it's more the link between land use and nitrate concentration in the aquifer that is of concern and that we want to work on. There are also some large issues related to the preservation of biodiversity and the link between land use and the preservation of this biodiversity, especially for some endangered species such as the little bust. And there is also a policy and strategy of relocalization of food production that may have an impact on land use and also the critical zone. Next slide. So the way we are going to look at this problem in these two case studies is going to be the following. We are going to evaluate land use dynamics and identify land use drivers. And then we are going to look through biophysical modeling of the impact on groundwater of these changes. And we are going to look also at the benefits and the negative effects that are associated with these land use change and especially land abandonment. And we want to look at the perception and the preferences related to these services that are associated with land use dynamics. What we will do also is look at the past land use dynamics, but also we are going to build future scenarios with stakeholders, and we want to also quantify the impact of those future scenarios. Next slide, please. So in terms of a bit more details about what we will do, we are going to work on the characterization of this land use change and trying to retrace the evolution of land use in the past, and especially the dynamics of abandoned land. And we are going to use existing land use data and remote sensing data in collaboration with our partner CLS. And we will also carry out some interviews with key informants in order to identify the drivers of this land use change over time. Next slide, please. Then when we look at the impact on aquifer, we are going to look at the impact of land use. So we will do the modeling of nitrogen discharge in the Vistrank area with the lumped model BISH, which is going to give us the opportunity to make a link between land use and also agricultural practices and determine nitrate flow and model these the impact on nitrate concentration in groundwater, depending on the type of land use that are happening, land use change that are happening in the area. Next slide. In the less case, we are going to have a slightly different approach. We will use land use dynamic also as an input, but we will try to, in this case, evaluate evapotranspiration by making some links between this land use and evapotranspiration. And then this will allow us to estimate effective precipitation that will be used as an input to estimate groundwater levels and water flow at the outlet of the less aquifer, which is the less spring, that will be estimated through a semi-lump sum model called the TEMPO. Next, we will also, so these were more the biophysical approaches. We will also develop economic, socioeconomic approach in which we will try to evaluate the perceptions of the services and disservices that are associated to different type of land use. And we will especially try to investigate the impact, services and disservices that are associated with different type of abandoned land. Here you see different pictures of vineyards that are or either used or more or less abandoned, and we are trying to estimate the different type of services associated with that. We will make a participatory design of future land use scenarios. And finally, we will evaluate these future land use scenarios through quantitative surveys of the services and disservices again. Next and final slide. Just to mention that this work is going to be made in partnership with people that are here, some groupment of municipalities in the Montpellier and in the Nîmes area, and also some local water organization, the CIBL and the PTV Vistrank. Thank you.
All right, we'll move on next to our Italian colleagues, and I believe Maddalena, you're in charge.
Yes. Good morning, evening, and afternoon to everyone. I'm Maddalena Pennisi, and I'm a geochemist at the Georesource Institute of the National Research Council, and I'm here for the Italian group that I will describe very soon. So for ABRESO, we have decided to study land abandonment in the Alps, Italian Alps, and that are where the semi-natural grassland are recognized as a priority status habitat by the European Habitat Directive. In this setting, the traditional mountain agriculture have led to a predominance of this natural grassland, and in particular with the seasonal grazing alpeggio, have inhibited over centuries the development of the arboreal vegetation. And we will see this have been changing now. To an example of the landscapes in the picture of Giovanni Segantini. Next, please. What happened in the area we will study? The effect of the human presence in the Alpine mountains started with the human activities in several centuries ago that causes deforestation first, then induce agriculture and pastoralism with the development of the semi-arable Alpine grassland. But today, since the beginning of the 19th century and is still ongoing, reforestation and tree encroachment occur. So this is our focus. As Osamu described, the ecosystem services is net semi-natural alpine grassland develops that goes from cultural services, provisioning service, and environmental regulation services that include the soil stability, the risk of landslide, of the carbon storage. I do not enter now in details. Next, please. The three sites that we have selected, three sites that are located along the Alpine chain, so from the east to the western side. So the land use change and abandonment of the traditional agricultural practice is the main focus, but it's different in the three sites. In particular, at the Naschetta, in the Gran Paradiso, Piemonte, and in Valmalene, in the Trentino Alto Adige, the two opposite sides of the Alps, pasture are going to be abandoned and tree encroachment is occurring. While in the Val Grande Piemonte, that is also a UNESCO National Park, a different process occurs, that is the abandonment of the terraced that are a kind of land stolen to the trees, to the forest, that with time have been used for agricultural purpose. So the drivers that we expect to study are economic, demographic, or climatic, while the effects will be the conversion or the abandonment of the forest management. Thank you, Tim. Next, please, sorry. Just some example, you can see on the left, Noasca, where the pashman abandonment is evident from the 15th to present day. You can see at the bottom that on the left you have the pasture, while on the right, in the same place, you just have the tree encroachment. You also can see the status of the terrassement at the Val Grande now, where the forest is covering everything. And I also would like to stress you on the right, the church, whose size is done was built for hosted 100 of persons, while today at this place just 17 persons are living. On the right, we have the Valmalene, the third study site we have with the orthophoto that will be provided without other material from our stakeholders to see variation during time. And also in the bottom, you see the difference of the three main feature of the study case of the pasture with a very high, you cannot see, but is the high biodiversity is described. And then you have the advance in front of the young Piceabies and behind the old forest that is still present. Thank you. Next, please. So just very quickly, the Italian team belong mainly to the National Research Council of CNR with geologists, agronomists, researchers or the remote sensing, expert of all the economic science. The university sedimentologists of the University of Pavia also join us. You can see that the skills are different, going from phenology, sedimentology, policy evaluation, remote sensing algorithm. And I would like to stress that we will study in strict relationship in the natural science group and the social science one. Next, please. What about the natural science? Our approach would be to study land use change at the study sites, looking at biodiversity, carbon sequestration capacity in the different form, going from flux analysis, net primary productivity, and soil organic carbon content. And we will study also soil in terms of fertility, aggregate stability, or erosion. Nutrients will be also a focus of our investigation, including also the stable isotope composition in both plants and soils. And we also have a look at the traits in the water quality of the local streams. There are not very huge network of waters, unfortunately. Looking at climate change, the main aspects we expect to be in the snow cover, that local to the local warming effects, which is changing, affecting the growing season length and the productivity, and as a consequence, the adjustment of the grazing regime that generally starts in mid-June. Next, please. So this will be our tool. So at the ground level, we will have and we have we had data since several years already in these sites. The eddy covariance station, accumulator chamber, and the soil studies and vegetation study in the different parameters you see, that with benefits of lab facilities that we have in our different institutes. Another approach will be gained at the same time through remote sensing, investigating the snow cover monitoring in terms of extent and duration, the land cover maps, producing land cover maps and related temporal changes, and the extraction of spectral index for vegetation and soil analysis over time. Please, there is another piece, please, Tim. Thank you. Our goal is to bridge the ground monitoring study with the remote sensing ones in developing algorithms for soil organic carbon retrieval or for vegetation primary productivity extraction. This is one of the main goals. Next, please. Going to the socioeconomic science, the main question will be which are the relevant dynamics. And from this preliminary data, you can see that depopulation is a main matter of concern, with population almost more than halved from 1861 to today. Another first result of investigation is on sectoral composition done in 2013, with a decrease of a low, let's say, low agriculture extent in both three sites against increase in hospitality at the three sites again. Next, please. The stakeholders play a main role in our project. We are stakeholders from the two national parks involved, the Parco Nazionale Gran Paradiso and Parco Nazionale in Val Grande. And we will have strong support from municipalities of Trentino Alto Adige and other institutions at level of region or state, and also from a mountain association as UNCEM or promotion offices. The goal of the the social science will be to investigate the stakeholder perception of land use change drivers and preference for land management policies. The social science have already started with interview both of local population workers, traditional agro-pastoral workers and local firms, and also of tourists. Thank you. Next, please. And finally, the main question already started from the socioeconomic staff group is which are the main socioeconomic drivers that have been individuated in demographic drivers, as already I described, but also in market dynamics. That means the abandonment of the traditional agro-pastoral activities, but also service diversification at the level of school, drugstore, physician, internet office, and other, and also of cultural change with increasing awareness of the value of the ecosystem services, the change in family habit and taste, and the same for tourism of the attitude of the new generation. So that's all. Thank you, team. Just to finish, this is what we have started already. Next slide, please, just to conclude.
Oops.
So this is the main use for diffusion investigation, and I hope to do it well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Moving along, Hide, I believe you're going to lead this presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Hello, everyone. I'm Hideaki Shibata from Japan. I'm terrestrial biogeochemist and working in Hokkaido University. PIs of Japan team is myself and Yuichi Onda and Osamu Saito and Takashi Gomi. Today, Osamu and I will explain about Japan. So please, next slide. So we have 7 sites in the beginning, but we have expanding more. We have several land use type and land cover types throughout Japan archipelago. And you can see that right-hand side, the population in Japan is decreasing and land abandonment is increasing. So in the left side, we listed several social and economic aspects in Japan, including demographic change and some forest change and local community change, including land abandonment. And we have several scientific aspects for our watershed studies and with some stakeholders' involvement in Japan. So next slide, please. So we have more than 17 active researchers in Japan and different discipline with several postdoc researchers and graduate and undergraduate students are working on the different type of watershed studies and plot scales in different land use and land covers in Japan. So today time is very limited, so we will introduce a couple of example of the ongoing watershed studies in some sites. So next slide, please. So in the forest areas in Japan is very mountainous areas. Forest is very dominant land cover, land use. And then recently, less management of managed forest is one of the critical issues in the silvicultures in the headwater catchment due to the change of global trade of timber. And then this is the example of the current ongoing studies of watershed studies in headwater catchment to understand how this forest management and affect the qualities of critical zones in soil and water. And next slide, please. And landslides by the earthquake is another important factor for land abandonment in the forested area. So this is an example of the comparative studies to think about how the landslides by the earthquake affect the water and sediment transport from hill slope to the water. So we have the several monitoring sites in the different degree of landslides by the earthquake. So next slide, please. So you might remember that we had the severe nuclear power plant disaster by the great earthquake in 2011 in Fukushima. This is one of the serious drivers for the land abandonment in the forest and also farmland. So the several catchments was established to monitor the decontamination of this after this nuclear power plant in Fukushima. So next slide, please. There are several ongoing monitoring of watershed in the sediment and water, combining with the drone and remote satellite sensing to detect the abandonment land, and also the conducting the LQ analysis to characterize and predict the mechanisms of the sediment flow in that decontaminating watershed in Fukushima area. So next slide, please. So another the trends of land use in Japan is the due to the deep populations in the rural area. This is one of the ongoing studies to analyze the deep populations in rural area to alter the quality of critical zone in the special attention to the land and coast connections. So we have developed the several future scenarios of land use change and then try to understand how this land use change, including land abandonment, alter the quality of critical zone like nutrient transport from land to oceans by using the process-based models and also intensive monitoring in this watershed. So Osamu, please continue our
Okay, thank you very much.
introduction. Next slide, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Before I move on to the our case study site explanation, I would like to touch upon briefly about the previous project. So from 2016 to 2020, we conducted very large-scale the future scenario analysis research in Japan. Hide is also one of the member of this project. We call it the PANSES project. It's predicting, assessing natural capital and ecosystem services. We created a kind of integrated model of the socio-ecological systems to predict, assess natural and the ecosystem, economic, the values of the natural capital and the ecosystem services under different future scenarios, which Hide already showed. And then could you go to the next slide? So as part of this project, we developed the integrated model, which starting from the left-hand side, creating future scenarios, and then based on the narratives of future scenarios, we developed the demographic models, which predict the population distribution, and also we developed the land use model, which also predict the land use changes up to year of 2050. And based on the demographic distribution prediction and the land use change prediction, we also estimate the terrestrial ecosystem services, marine ecosystem services, and also that we consider the interaction between terrestrial ecosystem services and marine ecosystem services through nutrient cycle and sedimentation and the indicator species, etc. And also we consider the policy options in terrestrial environment and also the marine environment, including the setting up the protection area or the conversion of the abundant farmland, etc. Could you go to the next slide? So as a part of this previous project, we also worked on the 4 study site, which we selected as a more detailed case study. And one of the case study area is Akeshi. It's east part of the Hokkaido, northern island in Japan. And actually today, from yesterday, I'm in this Akeshi town and for the field work. And so I conducted a couple of interviews with the local stakeholders from yesterday with local partners here. And Akeshi is a small town with about 8,000 population. And it's the cold Oyashio current, affected by the cold Oyashio current. And fisheries and dairy farming is a major industry. It's also the tourism is also the kind of third important industry in the town. And then we worked on the Bekambushi watershed is one of the major, also the Ramsar conventions. It's also registered under the Ramsar convention. And then could you go to the next slide? And as a part of the previous project, we already can identify the key, the factors affecting from the inland forest, the interaction between the forest and also this area is very famous for the oyster aquaculture and also the crumb production. So we also already investigate the interaction between how the forest and also the dairy farming affect the oceans and also the aquaculture. So based on that, we already did some preliminary research and also the modeling survey. How also already conducted the scenario analysis. And could you go to the next slide? And also now currently the solar PV settlement is also the new trend in many abundant area converted to the installation of the solar PV. And then we already conducted, as a part of the previous project, we already conducted a wide range of the stakeholder interviews. And based on that, we created this kind of chart, which captured all different the stakeholders and also the mechanisms of the connection. This is a bit complicated, so I will not go into detail, but the green highlighted part represents the actors and components relating to the forest and the river, and in the middle, orange color relating to the rural communities, rural farming communities, and the right-hand side relating to blue, representing the components and actors relating to the lake and the aquaculture and the bay. So these are all marine-related component and stakeholders. So in the bottom, we list the stakeholders. The yellow color represents that even in the inland areas, the the marine areas, the actors play important role to conserve the forest and also the farmland. So such kind of interaction is already identified, and we would like to further investigate using this the research asset and for this ABRESO project. Thank you very much.
All right, we're going to keep moving along. River, I think you're up next.
Yes, I'm here. Good day, everyone. I'm River. The full name is Zhichuan Huang. Work for Department of Geography, National Taiwan University. So I am the PI in Taiwan for ABRESO project. And first of all, I want to introduce the location of the Taiwan. As everyone can see that Taiwan located in the Eastern Asia, and we also located in the subtropical, which means our temperature and the rainfall is pretty high. The next one, please. But the one thing I want to emphasize here is that, in fact, we also located in the collision between the Euro-Asia plate and the Pacific plate, which means the tectonic activity in Taiwan is quite active. And the height of Taiwan is still growing. The uplift rate is around 6 to 8 millimeters per year. And on the other hand, the climate in Taiwan is also quite special. We located in the corridor of the typhoon area, which means that we have periodical typhoon invasion. Annually, we have 3 to 5 typhoons in Taiwan, which means that we have abundant rainfall in Taiwan. Therefore, the annual precipitation in Taiwan is over 2005 millimeters per year, which means that the sediment transportation or the weathering is quite high in our island. The next one, please. Based on this environmental setting, we can find that some geochemical processes in Taiwan is quite special and quite high because we have the steep slope and the abundant rainfall and the warm climate. And therefore, the erosion in Taiwan is quite high. The erosion rate in Taiwan is around 6 to 10 more than higher millimeter per year. And the weathering flux or the weathering rate in Taiwan is also quite high. Because of the rapid surface processes, therefore the natural hazards, the rapid movement process in Taiwan is also very famous, such as the landslide or the debris flows. On the other hand, in terms of the nutrient concentrations, all the rivers in Taiwan has the characteristics of the low concentration, but high export of nutrients. For example, the nitrate or the dissolved organic carbon, the concentration of the two nutrients are quite low, or lower than 1 milligram per liter, but the export are much higher than the global average because of the abundant rainfall and the discharge. Because of this kind of the environmental background, the primary productivity in our streams is also quite low because of the steep slope make the stream water velocity is quite high. Therefore, there has short residence time to accumulate the nutrients. On the other hand, there are over 23 million people live in this island, which means that we can use our mountainous area. Therefore, the alpine agriculture and the reservoir support our society in terms of agriculture or the water resources. On the other hand, because of the alpine agriculture, which means that the fertilizer application will result in the diffuse non-point source pollution in our mountainous area. And because of the depopulation, the aging population, so the many agricultural fields in mountains are abundant. Therefore, becomes a serious problem in Taiwan. Next, please. Okay, this is the study site in our ABRESO project. We select the Feiche Reservoir as our study site. It's the most important water supply devices in Taiwan because it is the main water source for Taipei City, which is our capital in our country. And in this watershed, we have the dominant or the specific government or the office to regulate the watershed the management. Therefore, only the limited agricultural land use and the tourism and the recreation could be allowed in this area. The next one, please. Okay, here is the most important business in this watershed. That is the tea plantation. The area of the tea plantation here is around 12.8 square kilometer, and it decreased to around it decreased to 6 to 8 square kilometers during the past 20 years. But the business is around 24 million US dollars per year. So it's a big business here. The next one, please. So the farmer believe that the fertilizer application can lead in the high crop yield. Therefore, they used 0.4 to 5 tons per hectare per year of fertilizer to their tea plantations, in which there are around 400 nitrogen or the 40 phosphorus or the 75 potassium kilogram per hectare are used annually. But in fact, we found that it will lead a significant non-point source pollution in this area. The next one, please. Therefore, the government, they promote two practices to reduce the pollution. One is so-called the low-impact development. This device is used the filter in the tea farms, and they will collect the runoff through the materials named the pollutant will be trapped in these devices, which is an effective way in this area. And the other way is the government promote the organic farming because they believe that organic farming is more healthy and they are friendly for environment and also can reduce the fertilizer applications. The next one. So here in this site and in this project, we will focus on the 4 issues: the drivers, mechanisms, stakeholder perceptions, and the scenarios in our reservoir. We want to try to seek the way for our sustainability. And I think through this project, we can compare the difference among the sites and find the better practice for sustainability. The next one. That's all for today. Thank you.
Bill,
No. Tim, just stop here. Yeah.
well, we need to move on to the next talk.
Yes, thank you.
我们给人家放太多。
Wow. Okay, here we go.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm Bill McDowell at the University of New Hampshire, and I will give a brief overview of what we will do in the to better understand the biophysical drivers of water quality in our Lamprey River and Great Bay watersheds. And so it's been a pleasure to hear the perspectives from our different collaborators. And the next slide. Want to put the US case study in context. We're located in the northeastern corner of the United States. So just north of Boston is our study site. And the local situation is shown in the map below. And as we've seen with Japan, in the Japan example, we have a connection between the forests in green, the villages in red, and then the coastal systems, the Great Bay, which is down there. Yes, thank you very much, Tim. And ultimately then the nearshore coastal marine. And so the focus of the project is to understand how our sequence of land use change has affected and continues to affect water quality. And we use several metrics. And as we've seen in a few other countries, one of the things that is of most interest is protecting the coastal environment, such as the Great Bay, which is dominated by submerged aquatic vegetation, the eelgrass shown here. Next slide. Now, the Lamprey River is the focus of much of our work, the basin of the Lamprey River and its many tributaries and sub-watersheds. It's the largest tributary to the Great Bay watershed, about 500 plus kilometers squared. And next slide. What I want to emphasize, though, is that we look at the whole river and watershed system in terms of its water quality and what drives water quality, because many of the towns and villages, people live along the Lamprey River. And not only for the impact on the Great Bay downstream, but also the value of the river itself as a wild and scenic river is a focus of our citizens, stakeholders' concerns. So next slide. What I want to do is to highlight with three data sets that we have that can be used to try to understand how this trajectory of originally there were forests in these landscapes. They were converted to pasture, and now they are regrown to forest but turned into suburban house lots. So in many cases in our environment, we actually see population increases, and rather than the decreases seen in some of the other sites. And so what we see here is one of the indicators of water quality, nitrate, monthly average concentrations over about the last 20 years, showing a small but fairly persistent, it seems, increase in nitrate concentrations from these weekly samples that we've aggregated into monthly values shown here. So long-term data sets on the Lamprey River and other sub-watersheds are available to analyze for this study. Next. Now, we also have a spatial mosaic. We see again on the left the original map of the Great Bay watershed, and each of the black dots that you've added in is a new stream site. And so we have about 250 sites where we have a data set of 4 to 6 samples taken over 2 years, and you can see the total dissolved nitrogen on the right. And we see a wide range in concentrations from very low levels up to 2 milligrams per liter nitrate N in the red dots on the right. So we have a spatially extensive data set to work with as well. And finally, next slide. We also have a set of sensors in a number of different watersheds. which we can use to look at these concentration discharge relationships that Dr. Wymore has already described at the beginning of our talk. And we can see that the Wednesday Hill Brook, a suburban site and an agricultural site, has quite different response, both higher concentrations in the agricultural site and different seasonal patterns in terms of how nitrate concentration changes with runoff. So these are some of the biophysical data sets we'll be working with to understand how land use change, current land use practice, and climatic extremes affect water quality. Next. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Swim.
Yes, I'm Janet Swim. I'm working with Rosemary, and I should add Karen Gasper as well. We're environmental social psychologists at Penn State. Next slide. What we're going to be focusing on is what people's predicted support for the preferences among land management policies. These policies will be are designed to address the water quality issues that Bill has noted. And what we'll be looking at are first, this big overview model is individual differences among people and their preferences and support for different policies. These will be in terms of things like the values from the nature of future framework that Osamu mentioned, the perceptions of the need for the policies. So how much threat do they think there actually is to the water quality, and various demographics. And that's leading to some extent their direct support for the policies. But we also wanted to look at the perceptions of these policies themselves. So next slide. One of the parts of that perceptions is, do they we'll take a look at different policies, and do they think that there's any technical potential for these policies to make a difference? So if you give them a policy like removing septic systems or upgrading septic systems to their homes, do they think that actually will protect the water? Next slide. And then we also look at what is called a expectancy value framework for understanding attitudes. So the attitudes are about how much do you expect something will happen from that policy, and how much do you think you will value it? So for instance, these sorts of expectancies we anticipate will be about the perceived services and disservices that are affected by the policies. So for instance, with these septic systems, do they think that the septic systems, if they're upgraded, will it actually protect life in the river and the water? Or do they think that it's going to have any economic hardships for them? So that's the probability of those impacts. And then we multiply those by the value that people place on protecting the watershed areas and protecting or preventing economic hardships. So next slide. And then we also want to look at it in terms of their perceptions of the feasibility. So what the impacts of the policies are one part, but another is, can it actually be done? Is there sufficient resources and capacity in the area to actually implement the policy? And then apart from these sort of rational decisions, there's also a sense of what do other people think? So people look around not just about the policy and whether it should or should not have different impacts. They may also look at, well, what do people like me think? We look for social cues to understand what we will support. On the next slide, the other part that is an important predictor of what people will support for the policies, we think will be their emotional responses to these policies. So the other ideas there are like, what do people think? But people often respond to things emotionally. And so if things are going well, there's good technical potential and the services are there and they value it, they will probably feel hopeful about that policy, and that'll lead to support. Next slide. But if they think there's going to be a lot of negative impacts and that's important to them, they may either become anxious about them or they may be even angry about those policies. And those negative emotions will decrease their support for those policies. Next slide. But another possibility is actually when people think about policies, you get this sort of response of whatever. And we think that sort of whatever response diminishes that support for policies. And that whatever is a function of what they don't even see there's any technical potentials. They don't think there's any services it's going to give them, and they're not going to think any disservices are there at all. They just say, well, whatever, do whatever you want. And so what we're interested in is whether or not some of these pathways would change depending upon the different sorts of practices that we look at, or different ways of describing or the characteristics of those practices may change those pathways. So next slide. And so right now what we're at is we're at the point where we're trying to select some key policies to study further. There are a whole range of policies and we can't study all of them. So we're going to be narrowing down to some of the most important ones. And then from there, we're going to look at what do people by default think are these services and disservices. We can list all the ones that we can document, but what do people think about on their own? And so that's going to be the most salient things to describing them. And then we'll go to some of the model testing with looking at those perceptions, for instance, of what other people think and the emotional responses they have to them, and whether or not those things can change depending upon the policy and characteristics of those policies. Okay, thank you.
For the environmental drivers. So I don't think there's not any particular driver that I think I want to emphasize, but it was quite interesting as a starting discussion, because I think we could have said much more, but to start discussing some of these drivers and the ones that we had maybe missed. And there are a lot of commonalities, but we didn't have time to dwell so much on these commonalities between the different case studies, but there are quite a few.
How about group 2?
Yes, I'll report out for group 2. So group 2 with the underlying mechanisms that drive water quality is what we primarily focused on. We really looked at 3 topics, and we have a Jamboard filled with some good ideas. The first topic we examined in detail with even a little bit of a tutorial on the use of the concentration discharge, the CQ relationships, to infer the source of solutes to use as a tool in predicting trajectories of change with climate change, etc. And we believe there are sufficient data from most of the countries involved to pursue a joint effort to look at the CQ for different solutes. Second, we briefly touched on the value of understanding the flux of nutrients in particular from land surface as a function of land use and land change, land abandonment. And so these could be at the plot scale or most likely at the watershed scale. And when we think of the flux, we also should think of not just the loss in surface water, but also the entry or the accumulation of, for example, nitrate in groundwater as a function of the surface processes. And then third, we very briefly mentioned that the idea that several folks are interested in understanding the mechanisms that drive groundwater recharge. This is, of course, really important in regions where the groundwater is a primary drinking water source. So those are 3 large areas that people felt resonated with their national situations and would be of interest in pursuing across nations. Thank you.
Excellent. How about number 3?
Thank you. This is Osamu. So we discussed based on the template we filled in advance. So from US, we heard the abundant case of the mills and the mills dam, and because of the climate change and the population increase. In France, mainly the abandonment of the vineyard or the redevelopment of high quality vineyards. So the main target is vineyard, and it's also caused by the biodiversity offsetting programs and also some other the drivers. And in Italy, there are 3 sites, but the major abandonment is loss of the pastures and the meadows, and also in Italy, the aging and the population is the major drivers. And then depopulation and aging is also the major drivers in Taiwan and Japan. So Italy, Taiwan, Japan, the major driver of land abandonment, the depopulation and aging. And then in Taiwan, target is the tea plantation, and Japan is abundant farmland and pasture. So these are in terms of major drivers, US and France, the major drivers is population increase and urbanization. In contrast, Italy and Taiwan and Japan, the major drivers are depopulation and aging. So these are some of the unique findings from our discussion. Thank you very much.
For group 4, River and I didn't agree on who was going to report out. So River, I'm just going to say 2 things and then feel free to say what you like. But we talked about the critical zone concept, and I guess there's 2 points that were important to me. The first is we discussed the complexity of representing the concept of the critical zone, not only to other scientists, but also to social scientists and stakeholders. And that conversation widened to not just the concept of the critical zone, but just the science that we're doing in general, and just the overall challenge of representing the natural science part of what we're doing to non-natural scientists. So that is an issue that, you know, we may need to grapple with. And then second, one of our participants posed a question about when we're thinking about scenarios and looking out into the future, just if we've agreed upon a timeline. And so, for example, if we're running models out to a certain year, have we agreed upon what year we're going to run it to? And so just developing some sort of common agreed upon date, not deadline for getting the work done, but we're all going to model out to 2100 or whatever it might be, so that it's more comparable. River, is there anything you want to add?
Yes, I think besides the 2 points, and we also discussed the importance of the delivery of knowledge, because we all agree that the scientific data is valuable for scientists, but cannot recognized by the stakeholders. So which means if we want to do a good scenario design, we need to deliver the value of the scientific data to the stakeholders to help us to decide the future scenario. That's what I want to address in our breakout group meeting. That's it.
Any other comments before we move on and start to close out? So we're gonna have we have a little bit of time for an open discussion. I realize people might need to start signing off. We won't take this too much longer. I just wanted to point out a couple things. First is we're working on developing our presence for this project and other Belmont Forum projects on the website that you can see right here. We'll send more information about that. It's a member-driven, you need to join CZEN. It's for free, but you just need to sign up. A couple other things I wanted to announce. First is that the Belmont Forum is mandating that the SRI meeting, the one the one that the PIs participated in back in June, that is going to be the annual meeting that they're going to require us to participate, either in person or virtually, through the course of this project. And we do have some additional funding, and we'll send more information on this, but I just want to make people aware that we will run again a summer school that we had been running in the past, pre-COVID, in Italy, and we'll be offering that again, and we'll have funding to support students and postdocs to go to that summer school if you'd like. It'll be focused on the critical zone and ecosystem dynamics, and adding in the social science aspects of the work that we're trying to do. We'll also have some money to support students. I shouldn't say we'll have, we have money to support student researchers, graduate student and postdocs moving between countries and between projects. So stay tuned, be prepared for an announcement on that.